Hello and welcome to our latest webinar featuring the latest research from the Academy of International Business. We have created this forum for discussing the research published in our journals, taking advantage of new technologies and providing an opportunity to discuss about the papers that have been published. You all, as you are participating, have the opportunity to participate in this discussion by asking questions. We have the Q&A function open. So if you have any questions or anything related to the research that the panelists talk about, please use the Q&A function to put in your questions. And our moderator today, that's John Mezias, will pick questions from the set that we have in the Q&A. Today is a special webinar because we are featuring research from our third journal, which is called AIB Insights, which in fact is a new outlet. Sorry, it's not entirely new, but it's almost entirely new because it's completely relaunched under the editorship of John Mezias and Bill Newberry. AIB members know it as the sort of supplement to the newsletter, which provides practical insights for teaching. Now it's fully online, but it's also a refereed journal. So today, for the first time, we're going to feature contributions from this newly repositioned, revised AIB Insights. The theme for today is COVID-19, and as we are the Academy of International Business, we are particularly interested in the impact of COVID-19 on the multinational enterprises operating globally. And for that, we have three papers, and we have three presenters presenting each of the papers. With that introduction, let me hand over to our two editors. I can see John and Bill here in the panel. Both of them are smiling at the audience. Hi, John. But first I hand over to Bill, who will introduce the journal, and then John will moderate the actual discussion. So over to Miami.
Thank you, Klaus. Thank you, Klaus. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. So thank you, everybody. We're very happy to be here, and AIB Insights, as Klaus mentioned, has gone through significant changes during the last year, and I'm here to just highlight some of those changes to you. As Klaus noted, John is editor, I'm associate editor. Then we work with Ann Hopeman, managing editor, and Shehi Weehua, communications director. And so just to summarize the journal, AIB Insights is, it's an edited journal now, which is one of the major changes during the COVID period. And our aim is to publish actionable international business insights. So we often think of this as like we provide TED Talks, a written TED Talk that's topical, that's thought-provoking, and it's designed to be actionable. And all our articles are designed to be used, for example, in classrooms, for executives to read as a short summary, and for people who are interested in a topic but not necessarily wanting to go into the very detailed Jibs type article to get an overview of an article. We focus heavy on insights, light on references and jargon and methods to make everything easily transferable. And our articles are short, up to 2,500 words in total. So they're designed, again, to be short pieces that provide very much actionable insights. One thing I like to say is, in a Jibs article, you might have a paragraph or a page at the end that looks at practitioner insights. And it's kind of an afterthought. Here, that's the center of the journal. So our articles are meant to be, those practitioner insights are really supposed to be the centerpiece of what we're publishing. New within the pandemic, many of these things were already planned before the pandemic, but they definitely sped up the process once we couldn't mail out the journal. And so we switched to a new peer review system. So as Klaus mentioned, we're now a peer reviewed journal as opposed to an editorial review journal before. We established a new editorial review board with fantastic members on it. We adopted a code of ethics. We switched to a new website called Working with Scholastica. This has allowed us to improve the submission process tremendously. It also allows our articles to be easily searchable, and it provides an automatic DOI for any article that's published, which means that any article will now be picked up, for example, by the different Google Scholar and other indexing sources. In the system, we're also backloading prior issues. All the issues back to 2013 are already backloaded, and we're working to go back to the original publication date in 2020, not 2020, but 2000. This is what the new website looks like. It's insights.aib.world. You can see a picture of the cover there. We have sections for authors, editorial board, about the journal, a blog. We also have a section with guidance for authors when you're submitting your papers, and we really hope that many people in the audience will do that. You're going to hear 3 great examples of papers submitted to our COVID-19 issue in just a second. And then in the website, you can download the articles. You can read them online, but you can also download them in a PDF format. And so this is the example of the PDF format with which authors can download for themselves, and anybody can access the website, which is open access, and use these articles in their classroom and whatever purpose might make sense. And so that's my very short introduction to the journal. Again, thank you, Klaus, for organizing this session. We really appreciate the work of AIB and highlighting the action of the journals. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Mezias, who is also in Miami and just across town from me, and he'll serve as moderator for the panel. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Klaus. Welcome. I'm John Mezias from the University of Miami, joining you a little further south from Bill in Miami, and I'm the editor of AIB Insights. And I'm happy to welcome you to today's webinar, looking at how the COVID-19 pandemic is changing strategies of globally operating multinational enterprises. As our world continues to struggle with the COVID-19 pandemic, many regions still face far too many new infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. Even with the impressive vaccine efficacies and the rollouts, these are tempered by the daunting logistics of distributing vaccine to billions of people worldwide. The specter of continued economic shutdowns, travel bans, the lack of global or regional plans to combat the virus demonstrate the increasing need for insights into how multinational companies can adjust their strategies to manage the ongoing health and economic crises during such perilous times. This important and timely webinar features expert perspectives from a recent AIB Insights special issue on the effects of the coronavirus on international business. So please allow me to highlight a few aspects of this important special issue before introducing our first presenter. So this is the, as Bill mentioned, all AIB Insights articles are open to all. And here's the link for volume 20, issue 3, which is the special issue on the effects of the coronavirus on international business. This issue's 7 wonderful articles provide key insights for policymakers and firms to navigate international business during this pandemic. We're proud of these articles, and it was very difficult to select just 3 for presentation today. We actually received a record for us 41 submissions for this issue, which was our first fully double-blind, peer-reviewed issue. And I want to thank our recently established DRB editorial board and Tunga and Ann Hulkman in particular for helping us to manage this and get this out in such a timely manner. As part of the AIB portfolio of journals, AIB Insights provides a platform for actionable international business insights. And as a more applied practitioner-focused outlet, AIB Insights is positioned to publish special issues relatively quickly. And as testament to this, we believe that this special issue is the first peer-reviewed special issue addressing international business issues in this pandemic. Okay, so our webinar format will have each speaker take 10 minutes to summarize their research and discuss future directions. After all three presentations, we will open this up for questions and discussion. And as Klaus mentioned, please type any questions you would like to ask into the Q&A. So we're going to start today's presentation with Amir Shoham, who is joining us from Philadelphia. He will discuss challenges with overseas production based on his article, Rethinking Overseas Production, the Case of COVID-19 and Negative Externalities, with his co-author, Afra Shoham. So Amir, I turn it over to you. Thank you. Just unmute. There you go.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for inviting me. So this is a research with my wife. Both of us are at the Fox School of Business faculty over there at Temple University. And this is about the tension probably that we have many times between the company, organization, and the society. Not always we have a tension, but like a monopoly, any company wants to be a monopoly, but we know that it has like negative effect on society. So over here, we would see a tension about overseas production due to negative externalities. And there is negative externalities for the society of the home country in many cases, even without COVID-19. But COVID-19 highlighted this issue even more by having export restrictions that really pushed this additional level higher. And this created like a tension by the society of the home country and the multinational producing abroad. And we are using here an analytical model in the AIB Insights. We are using really graphs to highlight the analytical model. The analytical model itself is under review in an economic journal. So because this is COVID-19 and everything is new, we use this economic technique to illustrate our main points that are outcome of it. And if I would have time, I would also, we had an additional issue regarding to this about the vaccination of COVID-19, again, the tension between the society and the multinational. So just in a nutshell, if just understanding the big idea before I dive in a little bit more, is that multinational eventually is producing abroad, let's assume intensive labor industry is moving production abroad from a developed country to a country that is developing or a poor country in some cases, just to produce at a cheaper rate of its production. But if we have like products that are essentials, that could create a suboptimal solution from a society perspective. That you produce maybe something that is labor intensive, but is very essential for a society, like we saw over here in the pandemic, like all the PPE and stuff that related to that. So this is the main idea, just showing over here. And after I would show the issue, this difference between the society optimization and the multinational optimization, I would talk maybe about different solutions, and some of them are from a policymaker perspective, and some of them are from the multinational perspective. But before I go and talk about it, let's say, I just to be sure about negative externalities, I think that negative externalities, if we go historically, this is the ancestor of the corporate social responsibility, or even just looking at it of the environmental part of it. So really the main idea of this negative externality is that one economic unit impacts other economic units, but does not take it into account in its decision making. Because they're not getting compensated for it or not getting penalized for it if they are making the negative impact. This is like with the pollution, that's the most straightforward example. And we integrated this negative externality into the multinational location production. Now, if we talk about this negative externality, if you think about the multinational wants to maximize, let's say, take from the economic perspective, like the easiest thing is to maximize profitability. So we move a production, let's assume from the United States to China because it's intensive labor, or maybe to Vietnam, doesn't matter. We move it over there, but we maximize our profit. But we have here I'm giving two examples of a negative externality of the society that I'm not taking into account. One, me as a multinational, I don't care where I'm selling. And at the end of the day, if there is a shock, and this shock is like very unexpected, like this big export restrictions, we know that there are export restrictions, but at the scale that we had over here with the COVID-19, with the PPE and medicine, and even in some cases, even of food, this is at this scale, multinationals are not going to take that into account in their decision-making. And we said that subsidiaries of multinational were almost nationalized from that perspective, that they couldn't sell where they wanted. They sold just because all host country societies or any government first were focused on their own societies. We even see it today that even with the vaccination, we see that Europeans are not letting, even there was a new case that exporting vaccines to Australia now and stuff like that. So this is one issue, that a multinational that decides to maximize on the day-to-day production of PPE does not take that into account. But as a society, we have to prepare for very hard, extreme cases. The second is when a multinational decides to produce abroad, it's not taking into account that a concentrated production in a specific place could be a weapon against their home country. They're not taking that into account. They're doing the profit maximization, how much it costs, diversification, whatever, but they're not taking into account. And just think about the issue that there are some antibiotics that are produced, not produced in the United States, and they're mainly produced in China now. So think about that China could use that as a weapon in the trade war between the United States and China. Multinationals are not going to take that into account between them when they make their decisions. So this is the main issue, that the multinational is maximizing its own profitability, but not maximizing it from a social perspective. And again, I don't think that they should. Each company is maximizing, but we have this difference between the multinational and the society, the home country society. So I would use here a graph, a very simple, as I said, there is an analytical model that is under a review in an economic journal, but this is using a graph to illustrate that. Over here, we could see that the multinational marginal cost of production at the foreign, F is for foreign, L is for local, it's cheaper. So any company would maximize profit, would produce just at the cheaper place and produce this amount, and all of it is in the foreign country, and that's going to be the price. But from a multinational, but from a society, we would add also the marginal cost of this foreign production. And the real cost for the society is the cost of production plus this production abroad, this negative externality that goes and increases as we produce more abroad. So from a society perspective, we could see that the marginal cost from a society perspective is different from a marginal cost of production of the multinational. And that eventually leads us to a different solution. And the solution would be maybe producing less and producing even less at the foreign company, at the foreign country, and even there's going to be an increase of price, but what you get is that you have also local production. So from the society perspective, we prefer that there's going to be a local production and even a smaller production, but at least we are capturing into account also the cost to the society. And in this case, the prices are going to increase. And the increased prices are fine because you're really paying for your real cost of production. That takes into account also the social perspective, but it also takes into account that you're paying like a premium, like for insurance. That's like a premium of insurance. That when comes a bad time, you could upscale your local production, or other nations could not weaponize it against you, that you're relying on them for the production. And this is the difference. The multinational would want to manufacture just abroad at QF1, And eventually we see that from a society perspective, the society would want to manufacture also at home in a smaller percentage producing abroad. And this is what this is highlighted out of this COVID-19 huge restriction on export. And I'm living now in the United States, and we saw at the beginning that there was no PPE and stuff like that. And that was mainly because high demand, but also there was no supply coming in, and there was also almost no local production. The same would be also about vaccines now. Countries that are now understanding that they want to manufacture vaccines and have agreements with Pfizer because they could not depend on other countries, because even if Pfizer is a company, it's not eventually, it's manufacturing in a specific country, and that specific country could eventually, and does that quite a lot, like semi-nationalize the products, even if they are paying for full price, but they're still determining where it's going to be sold. Just one issue before I finish is that the main idea is that over here, the level of the externality determines with the essential of the product. If we have a more essential of production, this negative externality would just move upwards. And in extreme case, you could think about it like assembling F-35 could be cheaper in China than in the United States, but nobody thinks that that could happen, that the US would send the parts to China to assemble it. So this case, you have a very high negative externality, and eventually you're just going to produce home production. But in between, we have all of those PPE and vaccines and medicine and a lot of other stuff. In the other extreme, we have productions that have no, this alpha is the negative essential, have no essential, like clothing and toys. And in this case, you could produce everything abroad. We wouldn't want to intervene. But when we start having essential of the product, we want to go on and on and on. Do you have one more minute? Okay, so this is just to conclude. I could say that from a policymaker, we have here a justification really to intervene, and to intervene in the ways that there are different ways, through taxes, through other quantity restrictions or other restrictions in the company that is well documented in the economic literature. But I would say about the multinational, understanding that there could be a situation that the government would want to intervene. Big multinationals that have major parts of the market could think about taking measures before the intervention of the government, because when government intervene, usually they do it in a very extreme way that is would be maybe even more harmful to the multinational. So in this way of understanding that the government could intervene, maybe the multinational could take into account part of this negative externality to prevent this type of intervention. This is just the main idea of this model that we thought about that relates to COVID-19.
Okay, thank you, Amir. We appreciate that. And I just want to provide a reminder to everyone, please post your questions into the Q&A, not into the chat. And our second speaker is Kaitlyn DeGhetto, who is joining us from Dayton, Ohio. She will be discussing how the pandemic is causing many to rethink international diversification. And this is based on her article, COVID-19 and International Diversification, a New Paradigm for Multinationals. Kaitlyn, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, John. All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Kaitlyn DeGhetto. I'm at University of Dayton in Dayton, Ohio. So not quite as nice as Miami, but I have my beach picture here in the background to make me feel like I'm in Florida. I'm going to be talking today about my research, which is related to COVID-19 and international diversification, which was published in AIB Insights. So just to start out, thinking about long-standing assumptions on how multinationals think about diversification, both where they internationalize, but also the scale of their internationalization. So of course, when multinationals decide where to go and how to do so, they think about cost, and wage rates would be one key aspect of firms when they're thinking about where to go. Another thing along with that is, of course, research quality. So we care about cost, but we also care about the quality of human resources, so skills and abilities of employees, but also the resource quality of physical assets. And then we think about institutional uncertainty. So there's a ton of research out there that as a whole tells us that when there's high institutional risk in a country, such as corruption or incidents of terrorism or war or safety risk, multinationals tend to stay away from those countries in an effort to avoid the risk. So you can just avoid that country or region to essentially avoid those challenges. There's another assumption that goes back to the 70s that says, okay, well, internationalization, so the scale of internationalization can reduce risk. And this goes back to the idea of don't put all your eggs into one basket. So just like with your investment portfolio, you don't want to invest all of your money into one company. With multinationals, they don't want to invest all of their operations and resources into one country. That way, if there's a recession or a war or a natural disaster in one country, of course, they can rely on the others. So we know that those two things have driven where companies invest and also the scale of their investment. Well, COVID-19 came along and really blew up both of those assumptions in many ways. So first of all, when we think about, okay, we're going to avoid this country or region to avoid institutional uncertainty, well, as you can see here with the map, this is from Johns Hopkins, I just pulled it a couple days ago. COVID-19 was really in every country, in every region. So when it was declared a pandemic about a year ago now, multinationals that had operations in various countries had to deal with those challenges in various countries. And thinking about going forward with investments, you can't just say, okay, we're going to avoid the United States or Brazil or Japan or whatever country might be because there's some kind of institutional risk there. When this is happening across the board, we have to deal with it really in every country. Also, with the idea of having broader scale of diversification reduces our risk overall. When multinationals were broadly diversified geographically, this actually created more challenges for many of them when the pandemic hit, because they didn't just have to manage these challenges in one country or region, they had to do it in multiple different countries. And if you think about all the policy differences and the cultural differences and the health differences across these different countries, diversification actually created more challenges in these cases, which goes against the traditional assumptions, if you will. So because of all of this, I think that, and my theory is that multinational corporations might change the way that they think about where to diversify and how to do so. A lot of the insights that I wrote about in this article came from an in-depth interview about 90 minutes with a chief operating officer of a large multinational corporation headquartered in the US, publicly traded company. They have about 50,000 employees in 20 plus countries. Very importantly, a service-based company, so they're not involved in manufacturing, which is important here in this context. They do mostly business process outsourcing. And when I talked to this individual, they were in really the heart of the pandemic, when everything, boots on the ground, were trying to manage the pandemic and our operations across the world, because I think it was 2 or 3 weeks in when I talked to this individual. So just some key challenges that he highlighted to me. One would be just the technical aspects. So we need to continue serving our clients. Many of their clients actually had a higher demand during this period. So can we manage issues with people not having access to Wi-Fi, not having access to computers, not having access to enough power in their home environments? So in order to deal with that, this company, just to give one example, in the Philippines, they had to try to send a lot of their employees home to work. And in doing so, they had to bring those employees Wi-Fi hotspots, they had to bring those employees computers and get them all set up. And the challenge with this is you also have changing government regulations happening at the same time, where we have travel restrictions and so forth. So negotiating with the government to get through checkpoints in order to get the employees set up in their home work environments. Other challenges related to just understanding what the policy differences, of course, across countries that are changing all the time. Some employees, we can't have work remotely, so just renovating buildings basically overnight to have some employees actually be housed in the building. Social distancing needs to be there. They also had to negotiate with hotels to have some employees work from there. And then of course, all your processes related to cleaning and security, IT issues, so on and so forth, blew up overnight in trying to manage those things. And like I mentioned earlier, doing so across 20+ countries created many different challenges for this company. So in sum, this individual told me that previously they and their clients were mostly focused on the cost and quality component. But going forward, they got it done. Everyone did what they could with the resources that they had and within the constraints. But as it says here, going forward, continuity of business will be their enablees, their clients' #1 concern. So basically shifting some of the criteria and how they think about investment decisions. So several country level factors, which I detail in the paper, that I believe, based on the executive insights and thinking through the theory that I went over earlier, that companies will think about going forward. One of those things is how history, right? So how did governments manage this in the past? Government shutdowns, and we know that differed by country, but also by state and by city. So government shutdowns, of course, affected the ability of businesses not only to have their employees travel, but also to actually work at all. So this was had a great effect on companies. Government financial support, so we know there's lots of stimulus money coming out and continuing to in different countries. So how that supported different businesses in different ways. And I think that is something that multinationals will take into consideration. Strength of the healthcare system and stability of home work environments. So infrastructure related to allowing employees to be able to work from home and making this feasible for multinationals, knowing that it might be continued in the months and years to come with COVID-19, but potentially with future pandemics that we might face. So in conclusion, I think that businesses will have an increased focus on business continuity. So when we talk about cost and quality, of course, those things will remain important, but business continuity will bump up to the top, and we'll think about that and where we invest, where can we continue business despite these types of shocks or these types of pandemics will be key. With that, also focusing on strategic flexibility. So we know now as companies, we have to be extremely flexible, and this relates to being able to send employees home for remote work. In dealing with changing government policies, so developing those capabilities. And then, like I've been saying, reconsidering the scale of diversification and the host countries for investment. With this and the difficulty managing these challenges in multiple different countries, I think that multinationals will consider scaling down their operations to make things a little more straightforward when these types of challenges or crises happen. And where to invest will focus more on the infrastructure. So who has the capabilities to offer employees and citizens remote work and also healthcare. So healthy citizens who can potentially work from home very easily, and rethinking again the importance of other factors like wage rates. Also with that, we might have an increased cost by investing more in countries that can support remote work, but we also have to remember now that we might not need as many physical assets like buildings that employees can go and work in, so then we have a trade-off there. And finally, just to conclude, as far as future research is concerned, I think the most obvious one, I did the interview here and developed some theory or propositions, but to test this with firm level data. So does infrastructure that supports remote work, supports a healthy population, do those things actually relate to in the future months and years to come, where firms enter and exit? So that will be something important to look into. I also think that, predicting that remote work relates to increased investment, or the ability to have remote work relates to increased investment, will have some kind of interaction probably with aspects of policy risk. And so if we have an environment, now that we know we can have a lot of employees work from home, if we have an environment where, for example, there's economic freedom, or there's even lifestyle, people like living there, those types of things will probably interact with remote work to even increase investment more. We've seen that a little bit happening in the United States with some companies recently moving from California to Texas and Florida. Part of this has to do with, remote work is there, but part of this has to do with the interaction with just regulations and taxation that are beneficial to companies. And then finally, looking into more how multinationals filling these institutional voids, whether that was providing housing for employees, providing support for testing, contact tracing, vaccinations, if those things relate to important performance implications, so where the government wasn't necessarily stepping in, these companies stepped in. So will that lead to lower attrition rate of employees, more loyalty to the companies, higher perceptions from consumers, potentially better relations with the government, and so forth. And that's it. Thank you everyone for your attention.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. And again, a reminder to post your questions in the Q&A and not the chat. It would be helpful. Some good questions coming in. And I would like to turn things over to our final speaker, Daniel Shapiro, who's joining us from Vancouver. He will discuss liability of origin using the case of a Chinese firm operating in the United States as tensions between China and the US increased during the COVID-19 crisis. This is based on his article, Exploring the Liability of Origin, Lessons from Smithfield Foods and Meat Processing in the US During COVID-19, with co-authors Jing Li and Kai Mitsu. Daniel, please.
Can everybody hear me and see me now? Good. Thank you for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. As John has mentioned, this work is co-authored with with Jing Li and Mitsu Feng. Our issue here is slightly different from what everybody else has been talking about, because it's going to be a bit China focused. And the question that we're asking is really about the boundary conditions surrounding the liability of origin. And liability of origin are costs or legitimacy issues facing companies because of their home country. So it is, liabilities of origin are typically about where a company is from, rather than as opposed to a liability of foreignness, which is about where a company is not from. So our specific question, and addressing this boundary conditions of the liability of origin, is twofold. One is at a time of heightened geopolitical tensions, such as occurred between China and the US during the COVID crisis, which was a combination of both COVID and trade tensions. Does this create a generalized liability of origin? That is, does it affect all Chinese firms? And the issue that we're going to address is Chinese firm, a specific Chinese firm that was in a non-technology sector, in this case, meat processing. So we can, I think, all understand that there's a liability of origin potentially attached to Chinese technology companies because of the national security issues involved. So our question is, does this extend to something like meat processing? So a little background on meat processing. This picture on the top here is a meat processing plant in the United States prior to COVID. And what you will see is that working conditions in meat processing plants have for a long time been under scrutiny. The occupational risks attached to working in such plants is about 1.5 times the national average. And the plants are typically in smaller communities and employ often immigrant workers, and this is true in the United States and elsewhere. With the outbreak of COVID, what you see is there was an outbreak of COVID cases in meat processing plants across the United States, and they were quite significant. And this slide tells you, for example, that 18% of the cases in Iowa originated in meat processing plants, 17.3% of the total cases in South Dakota from meat processing plants. Now, the thing about the meat processing industry in the United States, so we get this outbreak of COVID. It affects meat processing plants somewhat disproportionately. The thing to note is that the meat processing industry in the United States is a very tight oligopoly dominated by 4 firms. We're going to be looking at 3 of them, which is Smithfield, which is Chinese owned, Tyson, which is US owned, and JBS, which is Brazilian owned. And as you can see from this diagram here, those Tyson, Smithfield, JBS were constantly mentioned as examples of companies that experienced high levels of COVID. The meat processing industry had widely been criticized for its health and safety practices even before COVID. So the question, we're using this as a bit of a controlled experiment because we're going to look at the public legitimacy as expressed by public sentiment of tweets issued by Smithfield, Tyson, and JBS at the time of the height of the COVID, which is around April of last year. So we're going to be looking at data from about 1 year ago, and I'll explain that in a second. Just a little note about Smithfield. Smithfield was acquired by WH Group of China in 2013. It had a different name at the time, WH Group. When WH Group took over Smithfield, it became the largest pork producer in the world. At the time of the takeover, there was the takeover was approved by United States regulatory authority CFIUS. There was some discussion about the nature of the takeover, the fact that the company, although private, WH is a private company. In fact, its second largest shareholder is Goldman Sachs. It is publicly listed, but nevertheless, there were concerns that it had received loans from a state entity, state bank in China. So the bottom line here is that from a non-market strategy perspective, Smithfield then pursued what I would call a pretty classic non-market compliance strategy using the language of Hitt and Hillman. They maintained US management after the takeover, brands and identity. Here at the bottom, you can see some of their brands, some of their packaging. There is no evidence whatsoever of China involved. For those of you who are hot dog fans, you will see that they are the owners of Nathan's. You may not have known that Nathan's hot dogs are actually Chinese. They have, if you go to their website, you will see that the website portrays Smithfield as an American company feeding the American people. The parent company is listed in Hong Kong, not in China, and therefore achieves a certain degree of legitimacy by virtue of conforming to corporate governance practices that are consistent with the Hong Kong listing. We looked into the degree to which they adhered to industry health and safety standards. We looked at data in the paper from the American Health, what do you call it? The OSHA, the Occupational Health and Safety data in the United States. We discovered that, if anything, Smithfield received fewer complaints than its competitors. So from a compliance viewpoint, they were complying with all US safety regulations that were in place at the time. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, they were behaving in a way that was entirely consistent with major stakeholder goals. And the major stakeholders here are the US and Chinese governments. So according to the China-US Trade Pact, one of the objectives from the US point of view was to increase the exports of food products to China, and Smithfield is one of the companies that will do that and is doing that. And from a Chinese perspective, there was a massive, China is the largest per capita consumer of pork in the world. There was an outbreak of swine flu in China. There were pork shortages. So from China's perspective, having exports to China from the United States of pork was consistent with their goals. So here you have a company, Smithfield, which essentially is following this compliant non-market strategy. So what did we do? We looked at, tweets issued, and I won't go into the details of how we actually did this, but we looked at tweets regarding these companies in the period of April, the entire month of April, 1 year ago, which, as I said, was the height of the crisis. We used natural language processing and sentiment analysis to divide the tweets into negative and not negative. What you're seeing on the screen is the result of looking at negative tweets only. And what we discovered was that the number of negative tweets was about the same for all the companies, but only in the case of Smithfield was its country of origin mentioned. So China, as you can see here, appears in the negative tweets with respect to Smithfield. JBS, which is Brazilian, we find no evidence that Brazil was ever mentioned. Now, I have to tell you that in addition, I probably should have mentioned it before, that JBS has also been accused of price fixing in the United States with Tyson. Smithfield is not part of that action, and JBS just paid a very large fine to the US government for corrupt practices originating in Brazil having to do with US banks. No such charges have ever been made against Smithfield. So what you have is Smithfield, which has essentially been very compliant with regulations and so forth, being identified as a Chinese company despite its efforts to conceal that. So the question is, does this matter and what to do about it? So the rest of our paper is actually about strategies that companies can follow if they are faced with a liability of origin, and we divide them into three: distancing and localization strategies. That involves essentially doing whatever you have to do to distance yourself from the home country. And as you can see, Smithfield actually did that. The parent company is not listed in China, or its main listing is in Hong Kong. It localized brands. It portrays itself as an American company, essentially. The second thing is we looked at stakeholder and non-market strategies. So the question here becomes, is it sufficient to look at major stakeholders, in this case the national governments of China and the US as being the most critical, or do you have to put more emphasis on broader public stakeholders, including the public at large? These sentiment analyses are measuring public sentiment. They're the overall view of people at large about this Chinese company. And finally, we looked at marketing and social media strategies, which is to de-emphasize the country of origin, directly address relevant issues, try to be open, accommodating, and authentic. That is, try to address not just the institutional stakeholders, but the broader public at large. You will notice if you look at this final slide, this tweet, this is February 10th of this year. This is a tweet from Smithfield Foods. A big thank you to the 40,000 plus members of our Smithfield community family across the United States whose dedication to keeping America fed is greatly appreciated. So they have gone on a bit of a tweet offensive to try to mitigate the liability of origin by portraying them not only as an American company, but as a company that that is dedicated to feeding America. So our suggestions are, we find this is an interesting case for teaching, to illustrate the liability of origin and how it extends beyond necessarily the issues that have been most widely discussed, which is technology and techno-nationalism. So we find that it extends beyond that, but it also sort of coincides with a couple of points that Amir was making, that is, in addition to the liability of origin, what we think we are observing across the world is a broadening of the definition of national security and national security issues, so that companies are increasingly discovering, companies that were outside of what we typically think of as national security, are suddenly discovering that their ability to operate abroad is limited. And the case that I would offer in point is the recent recent rejection of a proposed takeover by a Canadian company called Couche-Tard of Carrefour in France on the basis of food security. So I think what we're getting is, that's not a liability of origin, but it's a broadening of the idea of national security, which in some cases, like China, is going to broaden the liability of origin to a broader number of companies. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. And thanks to all the presenters. At this point, we want to open it up for questions and discussion. The first question I'd like to highlight is from Walid Hejaz. And he refers to the fact that given the pandemic is supposed to be 1 in 100 years or every 100 years, how is this going to affect policy? And also, what I think this is going to get to what's sort of generalizable to other global disruptions, and what are the other sorts of global disruptions we're going to need to pay attention to. So I'd like to have maybe Kaitlyn start off this sort of discussion based on this question.
Sure, thank you for that question. I agree, or at least hope, that COVID-19 is a once in 100-year event. However, I think that the way that companies are preparing for these things and thinking about them, I do believe that it's a long-term change, at least, that companies are making. As far as like what else besides a pandemic or healthcare related crisis, I think security related crisis we're seeing more and more, and I think are something that can more easily happen across the board, meaning, you know, hacks and things like this that affect companies not only in one country, but in countries across the board. As far as policy changes, I think at least we've seen in the US, and I don't know as much about how it's changing in other countries, but knowing that we're pushing more towards remote work, you see cities and states really focusing on changing policies to pull companies and pull workers to their cities and states. So even as the pandemic eases down, I think we see those things ramping up, and is just going to change the geographic mix of where people live and also where companies are located.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Amir, if you want to touch on this as a launching point for discussion.
Yeah, 2 points. One, we do not know the future, so it's maybe not once in 100 years. We'd have external shocks. I don't know if it's going to be the same, but it's like a black swan that appears, and we do not know if it's going to be 100 years. But even if it's once in 100 years, for sure, we have at least a short-term memory, also the policymakers. So this effect would maybe, even if it happens again in 100 years, we'd have like effect on policy in the next 5 to 10 years. At least in the short term, this national, as you said, Daniel, the broadening of national security into those other industries like food industry and medical industry and other industries would be there. And there was going to be a push from a society, because society, through the politicians, through the policymakers. So companies have to take that into account. And it's like a wave. If nothing happens in 10 years, probably would forget it. And if it's going to be once in 100 years, but at least in the near term, in the next, I don't know what's the near term, the next 5, 10 years, I don't know when the pandemic is going to end, because we are talking about, we were talking just before everybody came in, and are we going to have conferences next year? Could we go, and so on? But remember that in the poor countries, nobody is vaccinated, and this pandemic, even if we got shots and we are going to be we have a lot of, maybe we're going to get our protection, but there are going to be new variants maybe. So we do not know that this is going to end very soon, even if we are very, very optimistic. But in addition to that, it's going to affect policymakers in the next few years at least, and the companies have to take that into account.
And Daniel, what I'd like to do is if we could kind of shift things a little bit. Another question from Majid Gorbani talks about the negative view of Smithfield and Chinese companies in particular. Obviously, this started with trade tensions between China and the U.S. So his question has to do how much of this is related to the origin, the vaccine originating in China, sorry, the virus originating in China. And I would just like to add to that, is this going to put pressure on countries from being transparent about potential sources of viruses if they feel that they're going to be blamed for this or that this could exacerbate the liability of origin?
Thanks, and hi, Majid, thanks for the question. It's hard exactly to answer that precisely. Because the response to Smithfield occurred at a moment when China was being blamed in the United States for the spread of COVID, but there were also these trade tensions. So if you look at Pew data, for example, you see that negative perceptions of China have increased, were increasing prior to COVID. They did increase after COVID, reaching an all-time high. So these things are conflated. And I think part of our problem as researchers and policymakers is we're going to have to, I think, begin to be a little more nuanced about understanding causality in these things. So I'm quite certain that the part of the Smithfield response was about blaming China for the spread of COVID at the time. The rhetoric at the time was quite high. At the same time, it remains interesting that JBS, a Brazilian company in the same industry, has been accused and I think just settled a large corruption settlement, is accused of antitrust and price fixing in the United States. And this doesn't register. So I think we have to think a little bit about what all that, why those other things don't get noted. That wasn't a good answer, but it was the best I could do.
Oh, yeah, I think it was a good answer. The one other thing I'd like to add to this, Matt has a question here to stop looking at these as discrete events or adversity as discrete events. So as we look at these on a more sort of continuous basis, just a little bit of a follow-up for you, Daniel, with respect to that.
Yeah, so that I think I agree with that entirely. I think COVID has simply, I think as many people have mentioned, has accelerated trends that were in place to begin with in technology and so forth. But I think in particular, the why China to me is increasingly relevant in this is that the liability of origin being applied to Chinese companies, which I think I'm arguing is quite widespread and beyond just technology, is going to create a different balance of power in the world. And it is related to this convergence or the widening definition of national security. So the rise of China has provoked a different sense of national security globally, and that has contributed to this widening of the definition of national security. And that, I think, is not going to go away. So that is a long-term trend which may have been accelerated by COVID and is linked to COVID, but is not going to be COVID dependent entirely in the future. COVID will be part of it, but not all of it.
Yeah, this interesting issue of security, and many of us may remember there used to be something in the United States called Most Favored Nations, MFN, and that would be a designated status. And that's kind of gone away. What I say to my students in Miami is that MFN has changed to ABC, anybody but Cuba. But that joke aside, a very serious issue. What I'd like to pose, and maybe start with Amir, is as we look at the potential for governments to impose something like the Defense Production Act in the United States or these other security measures to ensure that critical goods, PPE, vaccines, and other things are going to be domestically produced, how is this going to exacerbate trade tensions? How is this going to really put a lot of pressure post-pandemic?
Now, again, I don't know how it would develop, but we see also governments starting to think about it. Or the U.S. is, if it's not by regulation now, but there's a lot of subsidized to companies to bring back like essential production back to the United States, for example. And as we said, essential production now are like a much broader definition of products than you would have thought about it like a year and a half ago. But I don't know how it, but if you think about this, as I mentioned, and this is for the policymakers that I quote over there, that if you think about some type of medicine as could be weaponized and other products, where if you produce them abroad, it just reduces the chips at the table, at the other side of the table. So maybe if the trade war would go on, and again, we have a different trade war than the one that we thought about at the end of 2019, it could maybe change the negotiation if the US brings back like much more of its essential production or part of it. I'm not saying that the production should be 100% in the US, but if now you increase the production, there could be a different negotiation than the negotiation that was before.
Okay, and maybe I can turn this over to Kaitlyn, and you can speak with respect to pressures against international diversification or putting pressure on the locations or acceptable countries for international diversification.
Sure. So I think this is one of those situations where we're already going in one direction and COVID pushed it or exacerbated it a little bit more. So we had a lot of trade tensions naturally happening even before COVID between the US and several other countries, and trade disputes, which of course those macro level factors obviously trickle down and affect what multinationals are doing. And so yeah, I see that this is only going to, like other comments related to, just bring back a little bit more protectionism than was already present and was already starting to formulate pre-COVID. I also think just related to support of other countries or trading with other countries, especially as it relates to healthcare and vaccines. We see the goodwill that countries gain when they do work with other countries. So like China now has, for example, been providing vaccines to other countries, as I understand it, more so than some others. So that goodwill that they're getting might actually help facilitate goodwill and trade with those countries going forward. But I definitely see those macro pressures trickling down to the multinational level and affecting, like you're kind of indicating, John, where these companies will end up investing.
Okay, and another question here from Jung-Hong Park. He mentions how the pandemic could have the potential for multinationals to start realizing the importance of considering the health of health-related factors in their home country and host countries, and with respect to the healthcare systems in countries and occupational health and safety for their workers. What we do see is, while governments are, we hope governments are well-meaning and they try to act to protect, it is oftentimes multinationals that are taking the lead on some of these issues. So is this an opportunity for multinationals to get more involved in the healthcare and the healthcare systems, and even use healthcare as a basis for selection in terms of international production or diversification? And actually, if we'll start with Amir for this.
So I want to take it maybe to another direction, in another analytical model that I have in a paper. It's about the vaccination. You know, there's a big tension now. India and South Africa, for the World Trade Organization, are pushing to a waiver on the patents. And we have a pushback from the United States and other Western countries or developed countries about maintaining the patent. But if you could think about that, companies like, I don't know, Pfizer or Moderna or other companies that have the vaccine could think through the nations to think about not looking at the globe as a one type of patent. And I thought that we should waive the patent, and that's a very extreme case, not agreeing to have the patent for poor countries. And I'm really distinguishing poor countries from developing countries. Because if you look to the Bloomberg map of vaccination, you could see in Africa, there's almost no vaccination at all in most countries. And when the companies like Pfizer or Moderna or other medical companies decide on R&D, they do not put in their NPV countries like Angola or other countries where we are talking about vaccine, about that. So if we take if those companies, I think they should take the initiative and say, look, we are giving up the patents for those specific countries. They could produce or get help in producing those products. We would have vaccination. We would also have a negative effect over here, an externality that variants could be, developing over there without vaccination. So I would think this waiver of the patent by the companies, plus subsidizing the production over there by the Western or the developed countries, would be a win-win situation and wouldn't affect future R&D in the medical field.
Okay, and Kaitlyn, if you want to answer this as well from your perspective.
Sure. I think I was trying to allude to this a little bit at just future research directions, because I think this is an area where multinationals did get involved a little bit already, and I think will continue to do so in terms of providing, whether it's testing, contact tracing, access to vaccinations. And in doing so, I think it might help create goodwill with employees, but also with potential customers within the country, and very importantly, of course, government officials. So getting potentially more favorable access to opportunities within a country, because the government, of course, might support and perceive the multinational fulfilling that void in healthcare. And doing that can definitely be a benefit, and especially when investing in some of these other countries, like I gave the example of the executive I talked to, were doing some of this within the Philippines and has really strengthened their initial results, but I think will continue to do so in the long term.
Okay. And Daniel, there's an anonymous question that it's a question from an anonymous attendee that is asking, how could countries actually attract foreign direct investment during COVID-19? And I think this gets to some of the security issues you brought up and also the liabilities of origin. So if you could give us your thoughts on this, please.
So this is about foreign investment promotion in the time of COVID. I mean, I think, honestly, my colleagues on the panel have covered this, I think, quite well, in the sense that we're going to see this tussle, I think, going forward between countries who still want to attract foreign investment for all the old traditional reasons, and the kind of externalities or national security issues that are being raised consistently. So I think from a simple political economy perspective within countries, you're going to see, I think, a pretty intense discussion about the balance between investment promotion and the kind of restrictions that we're observing. If you look at the latest UNCTAD reports, you'll see that the number of restrictive measures has been increasing over time relative to the number of promotion measures. I think that's right. So I think that balance is going to require some further discussion within each country.
Okay, and Amir, maybe you could share some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I would skip. I have nothing very important to say about it.
Okay, and Kaitlyn, just to round it out.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, to some of the thoughts that I had again in the presentation. Just investments more in infrastructure related to broadband, whether it's just facilities where people can work socially distanced, potentially away from home, but still have that space. So it's just going to be this ability to flip a switch and have people ready and able to work remotely and work from home. So I think countries that already have it, obviously it's good, but countries that don't, that invest in that and make it possible will be more attractive.
See, great. Yes, Daniel, go ahead, please.
I was just going to add to this that sort of an implication of everything that has been said is that this movement from a pure shareholder model to a more generalized stakeholder model of the corporation is almost surely going to be increased as a result of all this. And that was some of the points that were being made previously. But I think, for example, this issue of patents and intellectual property and the role that they play in the healthcare system and in the defense system and in the information systems is going to become increasingly important to discuss, and I think it will be on the table a lot into the future.
No, it's a great point. One other question I had, and it kind of is related to a point you were making, Kaitlyn, about strengthening relationships with particular countries. Do we think that these challenges that we've talked about with respect to the safety and the criticality of certain productions and the potential to weaponize possession of key goods, and is this going to lead to maybe a more regional approach to trade? Is this going to lead to fewer countries but stronger relationships? What are your thoughts in terms of how this will start to manifest itself in the dynamics of trade?
Sure, and that's a great question. And when I was going through the thought process on scaling down geographic investments, I didn't necessarily mean that we're only going to invest in 2 countries now. John, I think it's more the fewer, stronger relationships that we'll see in the future. So maybe now it's that we have 25 countries and we can zone in on, the 10 where we feel like the infrastructure is the strongest. Our countries have the strongest relationships between one another. We have, the strongest base of employees in terms of abilities and things like that. So I see less of, especially just how easy it is to do things that we're, with tech now, and that's a good thing, right? And I think we're going more in that direction. So I don't think it needs to be regionalized necessarily, but fewer and stronger.
So a new paradigm for international diversification. Yes. Yeah. Okay. And just to you, Amir, how do you think this would affect sort of, does this create a cost similar to a negative externality? This, if we are limiting the trade partners based on some of these other security and other considerations?
Yeah, okay. So we have to look at the 2 levels. Again, if we reduce diversification, it increases risk. But so companies would probably, if they have a push to produce more locally, they would produce in less places abroad, and that would increase the risk of reduced diversification. We teach in our, in the basic international finance classes about diversifying, and I know in other disciplines, about diversifying your sources around the globe, even if it are cheaper. So that would increase, and as I said, the outcome of producing locally would increase risk, and not increase risk, increase prices. That's also part of it, by increasing maybe the diversification risk, but at the same time, from a national perspective, you have a lot of gains of producing locally, and that reduces risk from the local society perspective.
Okay, so I see that we are approaching our time limit here, and I want to thank Tunga and Klaus for helping to organize this and handle the logistics. Clearly, the implications of the coronavirus on international business are highly complex, but we hope that this webinar has provided a strong starting point for understanding some of the key impacts of COVID-19 on MNE strategies. And we hope that these presentations are going to spur additional research examining the impact of COVID-19 and perhaps more broadly, global disruptive events in general. So thank you for joining us. Take care and stay safe. And I don't know, Klaus, if you want to have a final comment.
I can't resist the temptation of making a final comment. And actually I have two comments. The one, I see two discourses that we've seen here. One is more the corporate side, and especially the question how we manage risk. And normally diversification and excess slack are associated with being better prepared for all kinds of disruptions, right? So the more we diversify, the more we can draw on different sources if something happens in the system. But if we have a global crisis happening everywhere at the same time, it actually does, the diversification doesn't deliver. And the only way to address that is to have spare capacity in every country, which actually, in terms of the model that Amir presented, means a huge increase in marginal cost. If you have huge unused capacity in every country just to be prepared for what might happen. So that's the first issue here, that for future researchers, risk management. The second discourse we had was about vaccines and the challenge to vaccine the world. Now, the slide that you see behind me is cumulative vaccinations, doses per 100 persons in the country. And you can see, if you can read it, a huge variation. The UK and US are racing ahead. European countries are sort of less than 10 doses per 100 people. Canada is behind that. And of course, the reason is that the US is not exporting anything to us. And therefore, Canada, obviously, the choices are you go to India, you go to Europe. Maybe we want to source more from China because, being dependent on the US is, of course, a problem. If you look at the bottom of the slide, you see something called India. So that is where India is doing much better than most other emerging markets. So that is the other big issue. As a starter, I'm going to recommend, the camera doesn't capture it. I want to demonstrate here the last issue of Journal of International Business Policy from December. Which had a special issue on TRIPS, which is the regulatory environment for the which is the regulatory environment for intellectual property rights internationally. And if you want to study the challenges for international trades related to vaccines, that's a good starting point. The editorial in particular by Suma Athriya et al. It provides a good starting point for that debate. On that note, thank you everyone for your contributions and see you soon.
Thank you. Take care and stay well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.